Hello students, today we'll look at how inflation affects prices over time. Suppose we wanted to compare incomes or prices over different eras, hundreds of years apart. We need some way of measuring how incomes and prices have changed. As an example, suppose we want to compare how much movie stars made today compared with 100 years ago. Now, Charlie Chaplin, the most famous movie star of his day, earned about $125,000 per film that he made. Today, actors are paid millions of dollars per film. Tom Cruise was paid 45 million for a film that he made in 2012. Is it that today actors are paid just so much more compared with 100 years ago? Or is it that they are paid more because of inflation and they're actually not earning more in real terms? To be able to compare these numbers meaningfully, we need some way of measuring inflation and how prices have changed. Now, this is a modern problem in a sense because prices today just keep on going up. We're used to it. We just think that prices keep on going up. But this is actually not true. Historically, prices went up, they went down, but they did not just keep on going up. There'll be some years with inflation, some years with deflation, but it'll kind of even out. And even over hundreds of years, prices would be more or less the same. For example, if you read a historical novel and the hero is buying a horse, the horse might cost 50 ounces of silver, 50 liang. And if this was set in the Sung dynasty, it'll be 50 ounces of silver. It was set in the Qing dynasty 1,000 years later. It would not be 500,000 ounces of silver. It'll still be about 50 ounces of silver. Prices did not change that much over time. It's only today that prices are now constantly increasing, and we're used to it. But this is only because we're using money today that's created by the government, fiat money, and the government changes the money supply so that inflation is positive, so that prices go up over time. Now, there's a very good reason for this. I'll explain this more later in the course. But today, it's enough to know that prices do go up over time, and we need to adjust for this. We need to correct for this. Now, how do we adjust for prices going up, correct for it? We use something called a price index. A price index measures the amount things cost, the average price of goods and services within a certain class of goods and services. The most commonly used price index is the consumer price index, the CPI, and we usually use that to measure inflation. Usually for the CPI, we look at something called the core CPI. Core CPI is consumer goods without looking at energy or food prices. The reason we do that is because energy prices and food prices tend to be very volatile, goes up and down a lot. So by leaving that out, we get an index that's more stable, gives us a better idea of how inflation is occurring. There are other price indexes as well. For example, the PPI, Producer Price Index, and this looks at prices of goods that producers buy. There's also the GDP deflator, and that's the price index of all the goods and services that go into GDP, all the goods and services produced in the economy. Then there are also other price indexes like import price indexes, export price indexes, farming goods price indexes, that sort of thing. Now, the most important price index, the one that we use the most often, is the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. And what this measures is it measures how much consumers need to spend to maintain the same cost of living. That is, given that we are maintaining a certain living standard, we have to buy certain things, what we call a standard basket of goods and services over time. We look at how much it costs to buy this, and any increase in the cost of this basket is reflected in an increase in the CPI, the price level. So changes in the CPI reflects changes in the cost of living. And we usually use this to measure inflation. Now, CPI is also used commonly to adjust payments to people. So, for example, the government might use it to adjust payments made to the civil servants. They also use it to adjust payments made for social welfare programs. We call these cost of living adjustments, or COLAs. Now, this is the inflation rate graphed out. This is for the US. And you can see what I mean when I said that in the modern era, over the last 100 years ago, prices have been steadily going up. You notice that inflation has been almost always positive for the last 100 years. Whereas if you go back historically, that's this chart up here, the smaller chart. If you go back in time, you notice that further back than 100 years ago, inflation was both positive and negative. Some years we will have inflation, some years we will have deflation, but it evens out and prices remain pretty much constant over hundreds of years. Whereas today, prices just keep on going up slowly but steadily going up. So that someone making some a movie star might earn 100,000. 100 years ago they'll make millions and millions of dollars today. This is the Chinese inflation rate. The gray line is the official inflation rate. Now, the official inflation rate is constructed in Beijing from data that's collected from the different provincial governments. Now, the provincial governments have a certain political incentive to fudge the numbers a little bit. And the statistical in the bureau in Beijing knows this, but there's nothing much they can do about it. They have to construct the official inflation rate using the provincial data, and the inflation rate constructed tends to be too smooth. It tends to smooth disturbances out. Economists know this. They've actually reconstructed inflation using other sources, not our official sources. And there's this black line over here. And as you can see, the economists think that the actual inflation rate in China was more variable compared with the official inflation rate. For example, before 2000, we actually had deflation in China. And then in the early 2000s, there was quite high inflation in some years in China. This reflects, this accords better with the experience of the people, I think. So rather than 5% inflation every year, in some years it actually went up to like 15%. So how do we calculate the CPI? So the CPI is calculated by looking at what consumers buy, a basket of goods that consumers buy, and looking at the cost of buying this basket of goods. We cost this basket, we find the cost of this basket in the base year, and then we find the cost of this basket over every year after that, and we compare the costs versus the base year. And this gives us the consumer price index. This gives us a CPI. So for example, the cost of the basket in the base year is $680, and the cost of the basket in 2005 is $850. Then the CPI in 2005 is 850 divided by 680. And it's a index. So for index numbers, we usually normalize it to 100. So we multiply by 100. So 1.2 multiply 100 gives us CPI in 2005 is 125. The CPI in the base year is always 100. Now, what this means is that the cost of living, the cost of buying that basket of consumer goods is 25% higher in 2005 versus the base year. So, exactly what's the process of calculating the CPI? Well, first we have to find out what's in this basket of consumers' goods. What do consumers buy? And the way we find this out is we run surveys of consumers. So people from the Bureau of Statistics will call up households and interview them. They'll visit households and they'll interview them and they'll ask them what they buy. How many shirts did you buy last month? How much did you spend on groceries, vegetables, meat? What did you buy? Meat, vegetables. How much did you spend on bus? How many bus rides did you take? How many taxi rides did you take? That sort of thing. It determines the basket of consumer goods. Next, once we fix this basket, so many taxi rides, so many bus rides, so many shirts, so much meat, so much vegetables, then the Bureau of Statistics will go out into the economy and find the prices for these goods and services. And they find the prices, and then using the prices that they find, they compute the cost of the basket of goods that consumers typically buy, and they find the prices of goods every year. They fix the basket only once every 10 years or so when they fix the basket for the base year, but they find the prices for every year. So what's in this basket of consumer goods? Well, here's a typical basket. Most of what consumers spend their money on is housing. Now, housing here is not the buying of real estate, it's the renting of real estate. Rents and imputed rents is how much we pay for housing services. Next big chunk is transportation. So they'll include things like cars, petrol, taxi, buses, train rides. And then food and beverages are spending in the supermarket, medical care, recreation, education, so on and so forth. So this is what consumers typically buy, typically spend their money on. And you notice that actually the majority of what we spend our money on is on services, not goods. Yeah, rent, transport, those are services. Then to compute the CPI over many years, what we do is we calculate the cost of this basket over many years. We're always using the same basket, the basket that was fixed in the base year, but we're calculating using the price in the various years. So every year, the Statistical Bureau will go out and find the prices for the goods and services in the basket, and then they calculate the cost of the basket in the current year. And you take the ratio that gives us the CPI for that year. And the inflation rate is how this CPI has increased over the last year. So that's how we calculate inflation. Okay, let's have a look at this procedure of how to calculate the CPI. So suppose that we have a spending on the consumer basket in these 2 years, 2000 and 2005, and the cost of the consumer basket in 2000 is 800. The cost of the consumer basket in 2005 is 1050. How do we calculate the CPI? Let's use 2000 as the base year. So the CPI in the year 2000 will be 100. What's the CPI in the year 2005? What we need to do is we need to take the cost of the basket in 2005 divided by the cost of the basket in the year 2000, and then we multiply by 100 because it's an index number, and we find that the CPI in 2005 is 131. Okay, let's have a look at another more detailed example now. We have a very simple economy, and we're going to calculate the CPI in detail. Okay, so this simple economy, we have only two goods. The consumers eat pizzas and drink coffee. The basket that they have is 4 pizzas and 10 coffees and lattes. Let's calculate the CPI in the various years now. First thing we need to do is calculate the cost of buying this basket in the various years. So in the year 2003, we multiply the price of pizza with 4 pizzas, you get 40. The price of coffee, $2 with 10 coffees, that's 20. So 40 plus 20 gives us $60 cost in the year 2003. Now in the year 2004, we need to multiply by $11 and $2.50 for the coffee. And the cost of the basket goes up to $69. In the year 2005, it goes up to $78. Now, the CPI would be the cost of the basket in the various years versus the cost of the basket in the base year. We're going to choose 2003 to be the base year. And then we divide the cost of the basket in the various years by the base year cost of the basket, which is $60. And we get these numbers here. So the cost of the basket was 15% higher in 2004, 30% higher in 2005 versus the base year. Now, the inflation rate is the increase in the CPI from year to year. Now, in between 2003 and 2004, the inflation rate was 15%. Between 2004 and 2005, you'll take 130 divided by 115. That's a 13% increase in the price index. So that's a 13% inflation. So how do we use the CPI to adjust for price changes in order to compare prices, incomes, payments for different periods of time? What are actors being paid millions of dollars today? Are they being paid more in real terms versus Charlie Chaplin, who only earned $100,000? How do you make this comparison? Well, what we need to do is we need to do a process called deflating. We're going to deflate the nominal amount by the CPI to get a real amount of goods and services that people can buy, given a certain nominal amount. Nominal amount is what you get paid in money. So, you might tell your parents, oh, I'm being paid 10,000 RMB a month. That's a nominal amount. How much you can buy, that's a real amount. So deflating is the process of taking a nominal amount, you divide by the CPI, divide by the price index, and you'll get a real amount. Now, it's important to distinguish between deflating and deflation. Deflation is when the inflation rate is negative, when prices are falling. This happens during very deep recessions or depressions. For example, the Great Depression in the 1930s, we had deflation. Prices went down. That's not the same thing at all as deflating. Deflating is adjusting nominal values for a price index. So let's look at deflating now. Let's compare 20,000 in the year 2000 versus 22,000 in the year 2005. Which of these can actually buy more? Which of these are larger in real terms? What we need to do is we need to divide this nominal quantities, 20,000, with the CPI in the year 2000, and 22,000 with the CPI in the year 2005 in order to compare them in real terms. So if you look at this, the CPI in the year 2000 is a base year is 100 or 1 because it's an index number. So CPI is 1. We take 20,000, divide by 1, it's still 20,000 is a base year. But in the year 2005, the CPI is 1.2. We take 22,000, divide by 1.2, and we find that the real amount, the real value of 22,000 in the year 2005 is only $17,600. That is 22,000 in the year 2005 is only worth 17,600 in year 2000 money. And even though 22,000 is larger than 20,000, you can actually buy less. You can buy about, looks like about 12% less than you could with 20,000 in the year 2000. So it's important to deflate. Otherwise, you can't really compare these numbers across time. Let's look at another example. This is the price of petrol And we want to compare the price of petrol in 1979 with the price of petrol in 2007. Now, to do that, we need to use the CPI of these 2 years, 1979 and the year 2000. And what we need to do is we need to choose a year. The year will be deflating to. In this example, we're going to deflate to $2007. That is, we'll ask $38 in the year 1979. How much is it worth in $2007? How much would it cost if it costs the same compared with our cost of living if we had to pay this in the year 2007? So here's the way we do this. We take the year, the price in 1979, and then we multiply by the CPI in the year we're going to, and divide by the CPI in the year we're coming from. So the year we're going to, 2007, the CPI is 210. The CPI in the year we're coming from is 76.7. So we take $38, multiply 210, divide by 76.7, and we get that the price in year 2007 is $104. So even though it looks like the price in the year 2007 is more than twice as expensive as the year 1979, it's actually less. It actually costs less in real terms. Actually, the price of petrol was higher in real terms in the year 1979 compared with the year 2007. So this is very important to do, this deflating, because if you don't do it, you get very wrong ideas of how prices or incomes have changed. So this black line here is just the nominal price of petroleum. And you see that it looks like the nominal price of petroleum went up in the 1970s and then bounced around. It went up a lot more in the year 2000. But if you deflate, you adjust for inflation, and you see the real picture is that the price of petrol went up tremendously in the 1970s. And then it went down sharply in the 1980s and stayed low in the 90s. And even though it went up again in the 2000s, it did not rise as high as it was in the 1970s. So this is the red line is the real price of petrol. Is what we get after adjusting for inflation, after deflating with the CPI. Okay, here's another example now with wages. Are people paid more today versus what they were paid 50 years ago? We're going to use these US numbers here. The wages of a production worker, someone working in a factory, in 1970, they were paid $3.40 an hour. In the year 2004, they were paid $15.68 an hour. And it looks like they're paid a lot more today than they were in 1970, right? Maybe 5 times more. But once you adjust for the CPI, we find that no, actually, they are not being paid more. Actually, they're being paid less. Production workers in the US are being paid less today, or at least in 2004, they were being paid less in 2004 than they were being paid in 1970. And this has been a problem in the US. The factory workers, the production workers, their wages in real terms have stagnated. So here's a graph showing this. Real wages versus nominal wages. Real wages are the wages adjusted for CPI, adjusted for inflation. And you see that real wages used to be going up, but then sometime in the 1970s, they stopped going up and they've been flat ever since. Recently, it's been went up again, but for a long time, for nearly 40 years, they did not go up. And this led to a lot of anger in the US. Okay, let's try this example. You try it by yourself, please. So suppose that the CPI was 90 in 1980, and today the CPI is 180. And that the wages of of people starting work with an economics major is 24,000 in 1980, is 50,000 today. Are you being paid more today or not? Or are you being paid less? Let's try it out, and we'll continue after this.